Welcome everyone to this campfire gathering. So I'm very excited today because we're welcoming Damien Walter. So in case anyone didn't catch the film we put out last week, where Damien and David were discussing the deeper mythos of Dune, which obviously came out quite recently. Damien's a sci-fi critic and a columnist. He used to write a column in The Guardian. He's also the host of the science fiction podcast, and all around extremely knowledgeable on all things sci-fi. And I think did a fantastic job of looking at Dune in particular in our recent film. And today what we're going to be doing is expanding the conversation out a little bit and looking at how science fiction can really be used as a lens on culture in general, and what we can learn by really looking through a lens of sci-fi. So Damien, welcome back, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm excited and kind of honored to be here because I've watched a number of the campfires when they've been released on YouTube as well. So it's kind of just very cool to be participating in this. Thank you for the invitation.
Pleasure. So Damien, I thought we'd dive right in because since we put out the film around June, there's been a major science fiction related announcement from Facebook. So talking about Mark Zuckerberg's plans to create a metaverse, so to speak. And I thought maybe we could start by filling people in a little bit on the very strong influence of, in particular, Neil Stephenson's work Snow Crash on that word in general, but also on Silicon Valley and the kind of technology we're seeing coming out. So what did you make of that announcement?
Yeah, it's an interesting decision to make as the head of one of the world's largest technology companies. That you want to rebrand the company at all, and you can say a lot about Facebook's reasons for wanting to become Meta, but then to decide that you're going to take a word defined for its relationship to dystopian futures of mass control of the public, and say, yeah, we're going to own the dystopian future and control of the people through virtual reality, which was Neil Stephenson's thinking about it. So you wonder exactly what Mark Zuckerberg knows about science fiction. You feel like a lot of these people are they're wandering into the territory of science fiction, but in their lives they probably never read a Neil Stephenson novel. I know many people in the tech industry have, but I'm suspicious that Mark hasn't. And so sometimes if they have, they didn't realize that, especially cyberpunk, Neil Stephenson, William Gibson, the whole idea of like having your body replaced with cybernetic limbs and having a neural implant in your brain, that these were warnings about the problems of these things and not necessarily a road track for how we want to fulfill our near future. But they seem to just be, for the Silicon Valley elite, like a really cool idea that they're into.
Yeah, there's something, I think you've touched on something there that I've definitely noticed, because so I'm a really avid reader of sci-fi, maybe read, I don't know, maybe 20 sci-fi novels a year. I'm a writer, and I used to, for a long time, was trying to write novels, and I wrote a very long sci-fi Western. So I'm really kind of very immersed in I am very immersed in sci-fi. And this thing you raise of dystopias being interpreted as utopias seems to be very, very common. There's an investor in the psychedelic space called Christian Angermeyer, and one of his companies is around longevity, and not just extending our lifespans, but ending death. That's his thing. And he had a LinkedIn post which said, right, first we're going to cure mental health with psilocybin. All mental health issues we'll sort, and then once everyone's happy, the next thing they want to do is live forever. And I thought, well, no, I actually think I think a sign of health is being able to die well. And books like Altered Carbon look at, okay, well, what would happen if we had kind of functional immortality? And the people who've been alive the longest are the craziest in that book and those series. So that's I'd be curious to delve in a little bit more into just utopias and dystopias in general, because it is striking how someone will write a science fiction dystopia and then someone will pick it up as kind of without any of the negative bits.
Sure, yeah. I think it's one of those repeating tropes of dystopias that as soon as you have immortality, it will be cordoned off by the rich. William Gibson does the same. He has a family of, I think they're Australian kind of corporate aristocracy, and they clone themselves through time. But these warnings don't seem to get through to people, and life extension and immortality are another like obsession, I think, of the Silicon Valley elite. Maybe it's an issue with George Orwell, much as I greatly respect George Orwell's contribution to how we think about politics, and particularly the ideas of dystopia. That 1984 is this, boot in the face of a dystopia. It's completely oppressive. It's, that this society, everyone in the society knows that it isn't working. It's a bad place. Even if you buy into the newspeak, there's going to be enough there to tell you that this isn't the ideal for humanity. And I think that makes many of us think, when we pick up 1984 as our model of dystopia, that, well, we're not that bad. Yeah, as far as we know, we look at the world en masse, we think that it seems to be going better than Oceania. But then really, actually, the really significant dystopia of the 20th century is Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, and that's written, I think it's like 10, 15 years before 1984. And Huxley's vision was inspired by visiting America. And Brave New World, as much as anything, is like a parody of the American society that he saw, because you already had, kind of the beginnings of, in fact, psychedelic use there, which kind of inspired Soma in there. And it's a land of beautiful people who are having a beautiful time and who value freedom as their highest good, but who are actually very, very carefully controlled behind the scenes of that, through media control and through all of the layers of control that we kind of fear we're being more exposed to now. So this question of utopia and dystopia, I think, is actually more relevant than ever. And the smart question is, exactly what is it that we are potentially scared of for our future? There isn't just that dystopian vision of Orwell, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting to bring Huxley into it, and this maybe this, I think Gabby has just mentioned in the chat around his other book, Island, kind of which took another view on. I don't know if it's Gabby suggests it's perhaps a counter to Brave New World. But certainly there is a dichotomy in science fiction, I think, with drugs in particular. So drugs can be used to expand our consciousness and connect us to different dimensions. And thinking of famously taking the red pill, right? It's an ingestion. It's a moment of ingestion, which is a very Gnostic kind of idea, I think. So and at the same time, we can plug ourselves into something like the Matrix and take the blue pill and just completely forget about everything. And I wonder about the metaverse in this sense of all-encompassing virtual reality that we can sort of play. As I was watching Zuckerberg's thing, and he was describing, you can do this, you can work in an office and there's people walking around. I was like, yeah, but you could just work in an office. You can just go and see your mates. Like, that's just, you're describing a kind of a mimicry of life. So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are about this, specifically drugs in science fiction. You talked about in the Dune film this kind of psychedelic. I mean, there's a drug at the heart of it, right? But it's a perhaps not fully explored area of sci-fi, but very, very prevalent.
Yeah, the drugs in science fiction tends to be on this spectrum. They're either like Soma in Aldous Huxley, they are the means of control and pacifying the population. Or you can take it through to melange, you know, the spice in Dune. And this is like the liberative chemical, the psychedelic drug that lets people live much longer lives. You know, so that's something we're trying to do at the moment. Lets the navigators move through space-time. I'm not sure if we quite have plans for that with psychedelics yet, but you know, I'm sure that's probably coming at some point. And lets, you know, someone like Paul Atreides, you know, like scion of a rich household, like expand his mind into beyond just like the power structures and the politics of his area. And it's a bit related to the utopia, dystopia discussion as well, because we're asking about these technologies, you know, and psychedelics are a technology that we can file alongside many others from science fiction, like artificial intelligences and robots that might serve us, or androids that might even appear to be human. You know, are these good or bad things? And that's kind of the central question of the values that we apply to these technologies generally. And with drugs, we find ourselves like in this loop. So people who are more kind of conservatively minded are very kind of committed against the psychedelic revolution, for instance, precisely for the reason that many people are very interested in it, because it liberates you from these social structures that we don't all want to be stuck within. So I think like psychedelics particularly perform this value role. What are your values that the psychedelics can allow you to achieve or to lose sight of for the more conservative thinker? And that's a good, you know, that's a big fault line through science fiction, the conservative versus the liberal and our other political ideologies there as well.
Yeah, it's really, it's very poignant for me right now because I'm a participant in a study, DMT, continuous infusion study at Imperial College. So that's DMT pumped into your veins for 30 minutes instead of the regular intense 10-minute experience. Yeah, so it's pretty full on. And I had my first dosing a couple of days ago, which I can't talk about in great detail because the study's still ongoing.
I'm impressed that you're here with us.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I am actually, but yeah, it really struck me. What I can say about it is that something I was really struck by, because the nurse who was putting in my cannulas, which puts basically the tube of DMT going in and they take blood on the other arm, he was talking about Dune. He's a massive fan, and we were talking about the Dune film as he was doing it. So and it really did strike me as well, this is about a bit like taking spice in order to facilitate interdimensional travel. But what was very striking about my experience is that it was, as many psychedelic experiences are, deeply personal, deeply biographical. And it made me start thinking, you know, there is this theme as well, I think, in sci-fi, and I wonder we've seen it with our technology already, is that we have these utopian technologies that could open the world and connect us like the internet was, that eventually when you add humans into it, we fuck it all up by being human. So you have this kind of everyone's connected, and then we have this deep polarization on social media, etc. So it might be interesting to talk about that when we have these this combination of technology and then the dark side of being human, and that, like, how sci-fi writers have explored that, because that seems to be a really key watch out for the times we live in.
Well, I think science fiction kind of which is my way of thinking about science fiction, as our modern mythology for the age of science. One of the things that myths do is try and address the eternal questions of humanity and society. And one of the great eternal questions is, what is a human being? You know, and we go through cycles of questioning about this. So we spent, you know, however long it was, thousands of years, believing that human beings were basically divine creations. There was a creator who had made us, and however pitiful our lives were, we were, associated in some way to that creator, and we were going to go back to that creator in some way. And there's this great level of meaning to that story, whether we believe it now or not. It's hard to deny that it gave people just a great sense of meaning in their lives. And now what do we find instead? Well, we've gone through this massive cultural change. Most people probably involved in this conversation or, in the UK today have a very different sense of what a human being is, that science has shown us that we're like kind of fleshy, pulpy machines. We're like biological automata in a way. And it's very difficult to understand the meaning of that. And that's something that science fiction has struggled with from the very beginning. So if you look at what's often credited as the first science fiction novel, Frankenstein, A Modern Prometheus by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And like Shelley, she was this amazing young woman. She wrote this novel when she was 19, basically, and it survived like 200 years since. And we know it because it's, Frankenstein, the monster, the big head and the bolts and stuff. But that wasn't really what Mary Shelley was writing about. What she was writing about was what she had learned from many kind of scientific thinkers of the day. She was involved with all the intellectuals of her time. And it was this emerging idea that like humans were like machines. So if we're machines, you could take a bunch of parts of a human and stitch them together and wake them up with electricity. And what would that mean? Because that's basically what every human is in our model now. So what are you? You're just kind of thrown into the world, and the monster in Frankenstein goes on this kind of existential journey to figure out what they are. And I think science fiction, all the way through to things like Blade Runner or then Westworld and so on, is still asking this question, basically what it is to be human. Because the answers it gives us aren't quite sufficient. We can't get enough meaning from this idea of being a kind of flesh robot. So I think now other forms of storytelling are looking for kind of new answers to that as well.
Yeah, it's a really nice point. Makes me think of something that's always struck me, about the popularity of Star Wars is, I think without the Force and without the mysticism, it probably never would have been particularly successful in the first movie in the cinemas, right? And there's so much of the most successful science fiction is deeply mystical. Dune, The Matrix, obviously Star Wars, and I find that a really interesting mix because you described it as kind of like it's kind of the mythos of science, and it also seems that it keeps coming back to spirituality over and over again, with the exception perhaps of Star Trek. But then in Deep Space Nine, actually, it gets really mystical, and one of the captains is a kind of a prophet of a species that lives in a wormhole. But there's this kind of real mystical. Even there, you get some mysticism through. But so, why do you think that is? And why this mystical thread? And is it getting stronger, perhaps?
It is getting stronger as well. I sometimes, like science fiction fandom is divided, I'd say about 70-30, with the 30 being people who are kind of what you might say like psychedelically switched on, or kind of on some level mystical thinkers, and the 70% being people who are they are quite hard scientific thinkers, and what they like are the engines and the machines and the thinking through how we're going to go into space and build like orbital platforms. And that's their vision of what science fiction is, and it is the antipathy of the mystical and the mythical, and they don't like those things. So if I want to tease those people a little, you can kind of like go through a list of all of the mystical imagery in our science fiction, like the Matrix. I don't think you have to argue too hard for the Matrix. So there's clearly like a Messiah story there, but Neo in the second movie particularly is literally for the whole movie dressed like a Catholic seminarian, you know, and he's basically fighting the devil. So, you know, you have this lots and lots of like Catholic revivalism in science fiction through Joseph Campbell, who's a very committed Catholic. He actually left the Catholic Church because it stopped being Catholic enough for him. And a lot of the hero's journey of Campbell is taken, of course, from like Bible stories. So it's all there, you know, there's just a massive amount of mysticism. Our behavior around science fiction, you know, going into a darkened temple, essentially, to watch a kind of glowing altar giving us our sermon for the week, dressing up in the characters. This is something I chatted about with John Vervaeke in our interview, actually, you know, wanting to embody these people and then going to huge conventions like San Diego Comic-Con. I think the last one was like 250,000 people. So, you know, this is all of our religious need. Why is it in there? I mean, I guess the evolutionary argument would be we have some deep kind of evolutionary need for these mystical stories. They're playing some role. I tend to think, and my ideas around this are still forming, that there's basically a lot of truth in our spiritual myths. They talk about reality on a level that science fundamentally isn't showing us. Science is showing us a very accurate picture of a very tiny part of the universe, and myths give us a much more kind of nebulous picture, but the bigger picture, like the creation that we're actually living in. So when we look out into space in our science fiction myths like Star Wars, we just end up creating the myths because they're very deeply truthful and telling us things we really need to know.
Just before we go to the Q&A, one thing just came to me, which might bring us in a nice little circle from the first question. How, if we're looking at the emergence of, let's say, a metaverse type, a metaverse like Facebook's version, where we're sort of half or more than half of our time is spent in a kind of a virtual world, say, and it's augmented across the normal day-to-day operating we have, and we're just kind of jumping in and out of the matrix constantly, which we kind of are with our phones anyway. But if we take it to that next level, how do you feel about that? Does it give you do you get excited about it, or do you think, oh shit, that's not gonna end well?
Yeah, so for a science fiction person, I'm a skeptic of many of the visions of science fiction and their manifestation into reality. The thing I'm like primarily skeptical about is artificial intelligence. That's slightly a side point from the question that you're asking. And I'm skeptical about the metaverse. William Gibson put it this way, and William Gibson he didn't coin the term cyberspace, but he popularized it. It was being used in kind of some elite design circles, and William Gibson, as he does, he kind of picked it up, put it in his cyberpunk stories, and cyberspace was born. And the metaverse is kind of cyberspace again, with a new word for it. But Gibson kind of corrected himself. I think he did this like 7 or 8 years ago now. And he said, you know, I really thought that cyberspace would be another place, but it turns out it's just the same place that we were already in. Actually, the sci-fi writer Charlie Stross makes a good point about this as well, that human beings normalize technology almost instantly. So as soon as we can fly across the Atlantic in a jet plane, we just take it for granted. We don't think about it again. Maybe for 2 weeks, it's surprising to us, and then it's just there. And we will probably do this with the metaverse. In fact, we absolutely will do that. And I think my question is whether we really want these alternate spaces. At the moment, I think the metaverse was really it developed out from video gaming, but video gaming seems to be something that people do like a specific point and it fulfills a specific purpose. Maybe kind of like adolescent bonding happens very well in the metaverse. But I actually see that most people don't want this fully immersive experience because it's kind of extraneous information. Like, I don't want to have to look at an avatar of everybody. I'd much rather just hear their voices. Actually, I think that's why Clubhouse was successful to the extent that it was. So I'm skeptical that we will be sucked into a kind of artificial worlds any more than we have been to our already existing digital realities, which of course is to quite a large extent, but we are at least starting to recognize that this is happening. And in fact, we do it very quickly. Like, really, we started to see what social media algorithms were doing to us really just in the space of a few years, and you can already see people's behavior changing for them. So I hope we're not heading into the worst dystopias and that we don't all end up living in Mark Zuckerberg's 3D fantasy world, because I just don't think it would be very interesting. I think Mark's too boring to be the person who creates our reality.
Yeah, let's hope not. I just had a flash of that Black Mirror episode where the guy traps his co-workers in that game, the famous episode. I can't quite remember it, but what a horrific thought to be in Mark Zuckerberg's little cage forever. So yeah, no, I tend to agree. I think what often happens in Silicon Valley in particular is this disconnect from the kind of deeper human essence that's always with us when we're interacting with any technology, and this kind of forgetfulness or perhaps just kind of blindness to the messy human qualities that we're bringing, and the kind of the deep archetypal meaning beneath everything. So like, the metaverse film, these colorful kind of like incredibly cringy, hi Mark, what are you doing? And there's this kind of false interactions. It doesn't feel, it feels so performative that I don't think it could ever be something we were really experiencing. But yeah, it's a wild time to be looking at the world through the lens of sci-fi. I wanted to open up to some Q&A because I know we have a lot of smart people in the room. So I'm just looking through the chat, noticing people trolling me, suggesting that none of this is real and I'm still tripping. So thank you guys for that. That's very, very kind of you. If you have a question, perhaps put it in the chat. I know, Gabby, you were mentioning a few different things, and I wondered if you wanted to start us off.
Sure. Hi, Damien.
Hello.
So my idea is like, because I was listening to a conversation before, like the previous video. One part that I didn't see you mentioning over much, or at least I would like to see you kind of like extrapolate a little bit more, is that for what I understand, Dune was kind of like first a response to Asimov's Foundation. Just kind of like being a little bit more skeptical when he brings up the Butlerian jihad. Instead of just making AI this amazing thing that is going to save us all. And the other thing too is just the idea that we as a species, we have a tendency to outsource our thinking and our decision making either to machines or to charismatic leaders. From what I understand, the idea of Dune, aside from the hero's arc, which is very interesting, it is kind of dystopian if you keep reading the rest of the novels, because I don't know, I remember like it took me a while to get back to the other books once I had that realization, because I was totally on he's such a hero train. So I don't know, I kind of wanted to see you elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, Dune is a terrible universe because it's trapped in the medieval stage of human social evolution, and it was Herbert's starting point, because he was asked, I think it was John W. Campbell who asked him and said, I want a fantasy story set in space. And this is to compete with, or to reach the same audience as Asimov's Foundation, because Foundation is kind of the foundational science fiction story for the American science fiction community, written in the 1950s. And Foundation is all about the evolution of human society and culture. So it's inspired partly by Asimov picking up the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. So what you have in Foundation is the fall of an empire, and then a small group essentially of scientists who go out and form the first foundation. There's a second foundation as well. And what they do to control the universe is they create a religion. So we're kind of back to Catholicism again, the religion that the Roman Empire used to continue kind of being an empire. So it's this, in Asimov, you have then like the evolution of human society. But in Dune, you have the stagnation of human society, and the continual fascination, because in Asimov, individuals become less and less important. In fact, they're not really important. Psychohistory is important. The tides of history are going to define everything, and in fact, it rather affects the drama of Foundation, that it's all going to be determined through kind of behavioral economics on some level. But in Dune, you're able to tell this much more human story of wars and great houses and all of the things that humanity did through the medieval period that fascinates people in fantasy, like Game of Thrones now, another thing inspired by Dune. But then Herbert wanted to undermine that. So he makes the savior figure is also a charismatic leader, like Paul Atreides knows that. He knows he's going to take millions or billions of people to their doom on his path, but he can't separate himself from it. So the commentary, as you say, is definitely there in Dune as well.
Yeah, because I think Herbert himself said something that like charismatic leaders should come with a label maybe harmful to your health or something like that. And
sure.
Yeah, and the idea of Paul is just like he starts as like a space Jesus, but he goes from space Jesus to space Hitler very quickly. So, and I think that is the part that makes the series so compelling to me. It's just because there's that caveat that maybe I don't know. I think that a lot of his writing goes back. I wonder if he was a little bit of a libertarian, if like he places a lot of personal responsibility. Like I think that at least how interpreted is that way.
Yeah, I think he certainly was. In fact, I'm reading the last two books of the series at the moment, which I haven't read since I was a teenager, Herbert's original series. And there's quite a lot of attacks on liberals in there, actually.
Yeah.
And the science fiction community.
Conservatives too, aristocrats specifically.
Yeah. So it was, sorry, I forgot my point. There's something I wanted to come back on what you were saying, but it slipped out of my head whilst we were joking around there. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Gabby. And yeah, if it comes back, Damien, all good. We'll go to the next question. And also, Gabby, thank you for saying both Space Jesus and Space Hitler in one sentence, because that brilliant imagery popping up in my head right now. So, Guy, you have not one, but several, or two at least, interesting questions. I understand you can't speak because your mic has a problem. So I'm going to read your guys' questions out. So I'm actually going to go to the first one, I think, which is related to 20th century myth. Can you recommend a utopian sci-fi movie, or I'm going to say novel perhaps as well, as opposed to the usual dystopian fare? So maybe another way would be, Damien, what are your preferred utopian sci-fi stories that we might check out?
Sure. I remembered what I was going to say back to Gabby there as well, so I'll start with that, which is that just that Dune is really good myth making, because if you look at the myths of the young hero in kind of, we have some really good Navajo myths on this, like The Listener. They're also warnings against what it is to be a hero, but we've kind of lost that in our stories, like you know, Star Wars, for instance. You know, we just tell one side of that hero's story, so that's why Dune is better. And I think utopias. Yeah, I interviewed Neil Stevenson. God, that was some years ago now, and he made the point in the interview, because I put this question to him: why are we so negative about the future? And his answer was that it's all about Hollywood special effects budgets. Because visualizing a utopian future is extremely expensive. I think Steven Spielberg did it in the Tom Cruise movie that he made. I've forgotten the name of that. And it wasn't also a particularly memorable film. Whereas dystopias, you just kind of dirty up some pictures of, you know, the Empire State Building, or bury the Statue of Liberty in a beach somewhere. It's much easier to depict the fall of society, and it's much more dramatic as well. So, you know, the easy dramas come out of that, and dystopian stories are very popular. Hunger Games, also actually a very good piece of storytelling as well, the Hunger Games. But certainly my favorite utopia, and we mentioned this chatting with David, the culture novels by Ian M. Banks, because the culture is, I think, for everyone liberally minded, is the future that liberals want to live in. You know, we have some super powerful and completely trustworthy and benign computer overlords, the minds in Ian M. Banks, and they just sort everything out for us, and we just get to play and live for centuries and do whatever we want, but also be a bit bored. So what do the culture do? I mean, I'm not sure what Ian Banks would have made of like woke culture today and social justice warriors, but the culture are like the ultimate social justice warriors, because they find backwards societies like huge imperiums occupying like 80 planets or something, and they go and subvert them and remake them as better societies just for fun, because there's not much else to do if you're that powerful. But there was always a suggestion in Banks's novels as well that there was also quite a lot of manipulation going on behind the scenes, and potentially the very nice minds weren't quite as nice when you actually got down to the nuts and bolts of the situation. I think that's always the issue with any utopia. Like, it's somebody's utopia, but it's probably somebody else's dystopia as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the culture novels. I was lucky enough to have somewhat of a connection with Ian Banks, because he spoke at my university and I got to introduce him, and then occasionally exchanged emails, like when I felt brave enough to drop him one. And really, you know, yeah, I think it's a great example of a utopia. And the ability as well for people to switch genders at will is something I always think about in the current discussions that we see around gender, because there is, yeah, it is a sort of peak postmodern fantasy in a way, but and then there is a lot of darkness as well in the kind of culture novels. But this, it's an interesting one, I think. And Amazon were going to make one of the first culture novels into a show, which seems to have now not happened. It's kind of, I think, quite difficult. Maybe to proving your point, Damien, about making utopias, seems to have been perhaps too difficult to do. Sure. Yeah. So let's see who else we have. I think Magnus, you had a question.
Hi, Damien.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Jules Verne, I think he was a member of the Masonic community in Paris, yeah, and the Rosicrucians. And like, I've heard people argue that he brought some of that kind of esoteric teaching and sort of encoded it in secret in Captain Nemo and other books. And I wonder if that was just like of its time, or there's this more of a actually is quite common. Yeah.
Yeah, well, many of the British science fiction and especially the fantasy writers of like the Victorian era were involved with the Order of the Golden Dawn and kind of the Rosicrucians as well, and the Masons. Who's the one I'm trying to think of? The author of Dracula. And many of the ideas in Dracula as well are kind of hermetic in their origins. And if you think about what we're doing with science fiction, it kind of meets a lot of the hermetic principles. I mean, firstly, a lot of our very early kind of the roots of science, like Giordano Bruno. So he is an early physicist essentially, and was an alchemist as well. And, of course, the word alchemy comes from, the word chemistry is derived from alchemy. But the idea is, it wasn't simply that they got kind of ideas about chemistry from there. There were very fundamental ideas for science kind of encoded into Hermeticism. So the basic one that Bruno was drawing on was the idea that you could have a model of something in reality that wasn't the thing itself. Like you could therefore have a molecular structure that told you about the movement of water, for instance, because you could have a model of it. And it's kind of shocking that you really had to think back to what the psychology before that would have been, before we actually realized that you could model things in this way, which is what we're doing with science. And what we're also doing with science fiction as well, because we typically, I think of science fiction writers, good ones like Frank Herbert or Ian M. Banks, as systems thinkers. So they're people who can, in the case of Ian Banks, think, well, what would a utopian society actually do? How will it interact with other levels of civilization? He can play out in his thinking kind of the clashes of different scales of civilization. And that's very important for us to be able to do, because we're kind of doing that real time on planet Earth at the moment, clashing like conservative with liberal societies and trying to figure out what's happening. So I think it's just a natural overlap that someone who is like a systems thinker and is a science fiction writer would probably be very fascinated with Hermetic traditions as well, and learn lessons from them. I don't know specifically about Jules Verne and Captain Nemo, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me if that was true.
So please, if I missed your question in the chat, please put it back in, because it's the chat's a little bit busy, or physically raise your hand. And while we're waiting for that, Damien, something just struck me about, we haven't talked yet about genre, right, in general, and what gets to be called science fiction and what doesn't, and the bridges between, say, sci-fi and fantasy. You've touched on it a little bit, but for example, there's this phrase speculative fiction that gets used to kind of euphemistically for people who write, say like Kazuo Ishiguro, who writes, science fiction, but he has too much literary prowess, and so it'll often be referred to as speculative fiction. What do you make of that? Like, I guess we're talking now about the attitudes that we have towards sci-fi and how good an art form it is.
I think everyone will be rushing to be a science fiction writer again in about 5 years' time. I'll put that out there as a prediction. People will have science fiction like tattooed on their book covers, because probably for at least a decade, it has been a term that people have avoided. You don't see it used actually even in the marketing of a film like Dune, which is clearly science fiction, but you would, if you go and look at the marketing campaigns for that, that's not a term that they're using for it generally. Might be categorized on that on Netflix maybe. And yeah, you have all of these terms. Maybe the key one really is science fiction and fantasy. So you have loads of derivations of science fiction, sci-fi, speculative fiction, skiffy, which is sci-fi pronounced literally, and they all have various different allegiances. Speculative fiction is more the literary end, science fiction often used as SF. But this science fiction never escapes from fantasy, which is very annoying for kind of that 70% of science fiction fans who are there for the science, and they object to the fact that it's always linked with fantasy. But we're doing this for a reason, because really science fiction is a kind of fantasy for people who like that kind of fantasy. It's a subset of what we do with fantasy, which is try and envision the world in the way that we want it, and the values that we want to experience, and the lives that we want to live out. And science fiction is like, in general, a set of values, like the competent engineer, who was very often the hero of Arthur C. Clarke's stories, for instance, the guy who can build the space elevator. And that's a really powerful fantasy to live out for the kind of person who wants to do that. So science fiction, in a way, is performing that role for people as well. I tend to object to the idea of science fiction as a genre. It's given birth to many genres like space opera or cyberpunk, steampunk, alternate histories. There's probably like 30 genres that science fiction has given birth to. But in itself, it's very difficult to identify what is generic about science fiction, what 3 things are shared across all science fiction stories, and you can't really identify anything. So I think what we're really looking at with science fiction is it's a literary tradition of it in its own right. It's like an alternate way of approaching storytelling, where in literary fiction, for instance, we assume we know what reality is. We assume we know the systems that things are happening within, and that saves a lot of time, and it allows us to focus maybe more on the details of mundane human behavior, which is a great thing to do in its own way. Over in science fiction world, though, what we want to do is question all of our basic assumptions about reality. And it's not that science fiction can't depict the mundane. There was a movement of mundane science fiction that did focus on doing that, but it's just not what we turn to science fiction for. As with a novel like Dune, we want to follow a human being beyond the boundaries of human experience. We want to follow them into a transcendent state, so we can at least partially experience that ourselves. And that's what science fiction is there for us. And that, for me, just doesn't fit within the bounds of being a genre particularly. So I have these arguments endlessly on my science fiction group on Facebook currently, or other forums, where I've done a lot of my learning about science fiction, arguing with the old fans.
It made me just wonder, listening to you there, Damien, whether that new sort of meta myth, new kind of myth, the myth of the 21st century, how you might know it when you see it, right? Because if I'm thinking about genre in particular, and like what makes science fiction, what doesn't, there is some, like, if you read a lot of sci-fi, as you start getting the grammar of that particular way of storytelling, and you think, okay, there's a world building bit, and this is world building, and this is not naturally happening, and I'm along with it in a way I wouldn't need to be in a different form, and there's lots of tropes that I can kind of get a bit of an anchor on. And I wonder about, things that burst the genre being potentially part of that new mythos, because it's something unexpected, right? It's something that you've never seen happen before. Like I'm a gamer and been playing games for my whole life, and I just know when I play a game, I know if there's a door, whether or not you can go in and out of that door, just because of the type of game it is and the rules of the world I'm in. I wonder about that, whether there's whether you might pick up in your quest, whether you might find something that just blows your mind, and that's the thing, that's the thread to the new myth.
Yeah. I mean, I have had this experience this year. in finding something that actually did have that effect on me. One of the things in science fiction writing, coming back to Frank Herbert and Dune again, is this idea of just by having one new word on a page, you can create a whole kind of complex of concepts for the reader. So Frank Herbert famously does this with the ornithopter. So he never stops to tell you what an ornithopter is. He just says they get an ornithopter, and you have to play around with this idea. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how much detail Herbert does give later, but you can just have like this contraction of words. And this is something that literary science fiction can do that like no other medium can. Actually, I think Frank Herbert kind of jumps the shark with this in the later books when he introduces chair dogs. And he doesn't give you any explanation of what a chair dog is, but it's very fun to think about. And then, but he uses it a bit too much in the book, and it becomes a little bit absurd, at least for my taste. But you're absolutely right. A science fiction reader kind of trains themselves that you hit the word chair dogs, and you're like, I'm just going to run with it. Whereas a lot of people are like, I'm just going to stop reading at this point. That's thrown me out.
So that's going to be stuck in my head now. That image of the ever-shifting image of the chair dog is now stuck in my head. So Patricia, you have a question. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. My question is, do you feel that science fiction works of a particular era have particular questions that they're trying to explore or answer? And if you feel that that's true, what are the questions for the 20th century works? What were we seeking to answer in those works? And what are the questions in the 21st century works that you're on the hunt for? What do you think the questions are going to be that the 21st works are going to be seeking to explore?
The 20th century kind of turned on space rockets and explosions, basically, and how far space rockets and explosions could take us. So we spent the first half of the century kind of thinking a lot about rockets and blowing stuff up, and that they could take us into space. So we wanted to take that journey, and it was a very optimistic vision that we could kind of take the rockets into space and explore other planets, or replace the rockets with warp engines or whatever it was. And then I think we did the space race, and that was the pinnacle of that. And then we just realized that we weren't close enough to anywhere to really get there and experience the kind of fantasy of space travel that we had. So then science fiction starts asking the question of, what do we do if we're just stuck on this planet together? And this planet is clearly very finite. And so we start asking questions about things like climate change, and we start asking a lot of questions about society. Like, this is the point where science fiction starts thinking a lot about utopia and dystopia, because we realize that if we're not leaving, then we're probably going to end up living in one or the other. And how do we get to a good version of that? And I think those are the 20th century questions, which towards the end of that century became the question of escape in other directions. So that could be psychedelics, the psychedelic experience, or like the expansion of consciousness, which Dune explores or 2001 explores. But where it really went was to virtual worlds, video games. What is it like to be the kids in Tron who are sucked into the video game? And then, or to have a video game that everyone in your society is playing, like Ready Player One. So I suspect the questions for the 21st century, to bring it back to the metaverse as well, are about how do we live in these virtual worlds and how do we balance them with the real world? And to what extent is it good to be in a virtual world? And we might be surprised that we start seeing stories which are really advocating for like complete disembodiment. It's already there as a trend in like transhumanism, but I think it will become like a dominant idea in the culture. I'm not quite sure how it will manifest. And there will just be some kind of old traditional thinkers who are saying, no, we want to be in our bodies and in real reality instead. So I think it might be this conflict between the virtual and the real that we're looking at for the next few decades at least.
I want to give a little space for one last question. We've got time for about one more. So maybe you just want to raise your hand physically or put it in the chat if you have one. Fine if you don't as well. We've gone through quite a few. See, I think we're good. So Damien, just to close, be nice to just hear about anything that we didn't cover that's been of interest to you or kind of exciting you in the realm of everything we've been talking about in sci-fi and how sci-fi applies to kind of deep culture. Yeah, is there anything that we haven't quite touched on yet?
I mean, one of the things that's been fascinating me, because discovering Clubhouse for weird reasons re-sparked my interest in integral theory and developmental theories, which I know are an interest of the channel. And I encountered them like first 15 years ago or so, I think, reading one of Ken Wilber's small books. And then I found, kind of rediscovered the community around that through some chats on Clubhouse and talking them over with people. And I've since been seeing like the developmental stages all over the map in science fiction. So I think Asimov's foundation, one of the reasons I'm disappointed with the television show is that I think Asimov had kind of from first principles figured out the kind of spiral dynamic stages for himself and illustrated them as various kind of players and powers within the universe of Foundation. There's some rumors that Gene Roddenberry was thinking in the same direction in the creation of the Star Trek universe as well. So now I'm kind of thinking about this in various directions of where these ideas of developmental theory might spark some new kinds of 21st century science fiction myth making, because this seems like one of the great ideas of the 21st century. I think the integral community are talking a lot about when will this enter into the mainstream consciousness and how will it do so? And I think it might be through a science fiction story at some point. So I'm looking out for those stages and that discussion happening in that space.
Brilliant, exciting, very exciting. Integral sci-fi. That really intrigues me. So yeah, Damien, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Great, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor.
So in typical campfire and rebel wisdom format, just invite everyone to unmute and say thanks to Damien for joining us, and a goodbye.
Thank you, Damien.
Thank you, Damien.
Thanks, Damien.
Thanks much.
Bye, everyone.
Was great.
Bye. Thank you. It was great.
Thanks, Damien.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And if you'd like to join conversations like this, check out our digital campfire. You get access to a load of member-only films, you can watch live, ask questions, come to our book club, our wisdom gym sessions, and our regular monthly meetups where we share what's going on behind the scenes, and you can also connect with other Rebel Wisdom members. What's more, you can also get discounts on our courses like Sense Making 101. Check out the link below, and we'd love to see you soon.